This is the Casting Shadows podcast, returning from weeks of silence with a new episode, a long overdue and promised episode on a topic that I hope will connect with a lot of listeners out there and spark discussion either here or in other places. But this episode is also inspired by the return of Carl Rodriguez of the GMologist Presents. Carl also was absent, took a vacation from recording, but he's now back. And Carl, it's good to hear your recent episodes. And the last bit of motivation to break through the barrier of busyness and that sense that there's just so much going on, you can't get anything done, to allow me to record a new episode is the widespread and interesting discussion about the October OSR event, or not about it, but because of it. And so toward the end of this episode, I'll share my thoughts in solidarity with those of you who have a tighter connection to that whole OSR community or that OSR identity than I do. But anyway, part of momentum is to keep moving forward, and in this case, to keep recording. And so, let's get into this new episode of the Casting Shadows podcast. During my lengthy hiatus, I got a kind call from BJ, otherwise known as the host of the Arcane Alienist podcast, about the previous episode where we talked about some techniques for time travel. And I'll share that here.
Hey Anthony, it's BJ. I enjoyed your latest episode, particularly your description of how you handled the time frame jump in a Star Trek session of the Star Trek role playing game. I hope, as a fellow Trek fan, you've been watching Brave New Worlds, because the season finale, and I think it's not too much of a spoiler of this, is a what if Captain Pike had still been captain of the Enterprise during the Balance of Terror episode where they first encounter the Romulans and their super weapon, and including down to using some of the same music and lighting and framing the shots as they appeared in the original episode, just with the current cast of Brave New Worlds. Anyway, great episode. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
Thanks for the call, BJ. I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. It was fun to put together. Unfortunately, Brave New Worlds is not yet available where I am. It's not on any of the streaming services to which I subscribe. I did eventually get to see Discovery, so I have seen the cast that went on to form Brave New Worlds, but I haven't seen any of the episodes yet. So it's something for me to look forward to whenever it becomes available. I am very much a fan of the original series, and I have, a limited relationship with the Next Generation. I have a fairly good appreciation for Deep Space Nine. I have, sadly, a lot of difficulty watching Voyager, and I didn't get a lot of enjoyment out of Discovery. But I'm still, despite all that, very much looking forward to Brave New Worlds. So I'm curious to see what they do and how they do it, and what the show is really about. So no spoilers, please, but keep your fingers crossed that I can see it soon. And as always, talk of Star Trek makes me want to play Star Trek Adventures. So I guess I'll add that back into the queue again. The two topics for this episode, one, as mentioned, will come at the end, where I will talk briefly Maybe I should just stop saying the word briefly altogether while I will share my thoughts on the OSR. But the primary focus of this episode is on running games with multiple GMs. This is something that's been a major feature, kind of a foundational feature of my play from the very beginning. And so when I see out there people talking about being the forever GM, or no one in my group wants, to try running games and that sort of thing, I'm always struck by the difference between my experience and their experience. Just one of the many types of difference that we can find out there in our individual cultures of play. So this episode will just be sharing the way I go about managing shared campaign worlds with sharing the responsibility and fun of being the game master. As I guess became obvious during the introduction, it's possible to look at having multiple game masters in a group as being two sides of the same coin. Either there are multiple game masters in the group and they have their own games that they want to run and they're run separately, and never the twain shall meet. Everybody might be using the same system but have their own campaigns. Like everybody might be running Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but they're all separate campaigns. Or people could be running whatever strikes their fancy. It's like, hey, do you want to play Delta Green? Sure. And then they play Delta Green for a while. And another game master speaks up and says, I think our game master's getting a little tired. How about I run Call of Cthulhu? And you go, yeah, let's run Call of Cthulhu, that kind of stuff. Let's do Broken Compass. I think that's pretty normal. The other side of the coin is where you have multiple game masters and you're playing the same game and you're playing it in the same setting, and everybody has characters and you're all sharing the same timeline, or you are working together in some way to make it manageable for you to comfortably prepare. All right, so that sounds harder in description than it actually is. So let's use Delta Green as the first example. Let's say we have 4 game masters who all want to play Delta Green and all want to run Delta Green. So rather than argue about it and burn out on Delta Green, instead, everybody makes characters. So now we have this pool of characters, and maybe they're smart. Maybe they make multiple characters per person, like a troop, so that depending on what kind of mission comes up, they can draw an interesting character who seems likely to get tapped to perform that mission for Delta Green by their handler. And then deciding who gets to be game master is pretty easy, right? It can be set up randomly. I'll be first, you be second, you be third, you be fourth, right? It could be done with dice, could be done alphabetically, could be done by astrological means like phases of the moon or your birthday or your star sign or whatever. It doesn't matter, but you'll have an order. And in a game like Delta Green, which is primarily mission-based, similarly Shadowrun, each game master could create a self-contained, let's use the word adventure for lack of a better word. Each game master can create a self-contained adventure, right? And the second game master in the sequence recognizes the events of the first and can deal with any, positive and negative consequences that come of that play. And then the third one likewise, and the fourth one likewise. And it cycles back around to the first one, right? In an ideal situation, this is pretty simple. You have responsibility for the entire world, but your responsibility ends at the end of your adventure. If you're the third person in line, the starting point of your world is different from the first person. You pay attention to what took place during Mission 1 and Mission 2, and that's where you begin your play for Mission 3. Now, sharp-eared listeners out there have probably predicted a limitation to this kind of play. Well, what about long-term plots? Right? Well, some of us don't play that way. Some of us don't do a lot of overt plotting on the story level, but if you do, if that's where you derive your satisfaction, then I think this is a totally legitimate question, right? How can we plan long-term if there's every time you get in the Game Master's chair, there have been 3 other missions between your missions? Well, you can either work with the limitation to create better art, and a lot of the Call of Cthulhu campaigns were written this way originally. Like Shadows of Yog-Sothoth has like 7, if I'm remembering correctly, 7 distinct adventures in that campaign, but they were intended to be interrupted by other adventures. So this model is pretty well established already in the literature, right? We're going to have characters die. We're going to have characters get worn out. We're going to have characters go mad in this type of play. And so having a variety of mission types and whatnot can actually be a benefit. And this can be planned out. You know, I want to do really heavy stuff. I want to do very political stuff. I want to do combat stuff. I want to do magic stuff. I want to get into the occult side of things, right? These things can be distributed among the game masters or not. They can be shared or they can be siloed. Right? It's really up to what you want to do. All it requires is a little bit of discussion. But we have our sequence in play. We identify how often we want to play. We identify how long, roughly, each, let's use the word mission or adventure, how long each mission or adventure should be, and we try to stick to that. We put an awareness in place of sometimes adventures go too long, right? They just don't move at the expected speed, and what you thought would take 2 sessions winds up taking 4 or 6. So put measures in place to, be aware of that. Either, 2 simple solutions are you only run, right, 4 sessions. And if your adventure goes longer than 4 sessions, then it's going to be interrupted by another mission, which can be interesting as well, right? Or we agree to let things always play out. A fun third option, which I don't imagine a lot of people go for, is to, at the end of your number of sessions, 4 in our example, the next person takes over. Your character, one character exits, another character comes in, and what happens. Now, some people might be tensing up at these kinds of suggestions, right? There is a sense of control or a sense of ownership or a sense of discovery or a sense of consistency, which gets violated by the idea of allowing someone to start a mission or start an adventure and allowing someone else to end it, to do the big reveals. All right, so either they communicate with each other so that there is consistency, or they don't, so that there really isn't. And this gives us that old chestnut, that old philosophical discussion in RPG circles, about what is important. When was something determined? It's not real until it comes out in play, so your prep doesn't matter. Or, I prepared this months in advance. It's set in stone. It is the truth. Or, you just made that up on the fly. You could have made up anything. Why did you make up that? So when a thing was invented, who invented it, and how it came out in play, or if it didn't, these are, the metaphysics of role-playing games. And it's really up to you to be aware of how these, in a sense, discussion landmines, how deeply they're buried in the foundations of your gaming group, right? You could be in a group that doesn't care about this stuff at all, doesn't even notice. Or you could be in a group that's very, very sensitive to them, right? We're playing with our friends and we should care about our friends. But these guidelines on playing with multiple game masters are just that. They're the beginning of the process. And this podcast is about broaching the discussion, right? Now, I've done multiple game master play a lot, right? And I've done it formally, not as often, and I've done it informally most of the time. I like to encourage the people that I play with to become the game master. I like to be open to the idea of them becoming another game master in the campaign that we're already playing. Because I don't like to ask people to give up their characters, and I want to be able to play with them in the world that we have been playing in and creating as we go. So I want to be able to join them in their fun. I like to be able to move to the left, one seat out of the game master's chair, and have someone else move into the game master's chair for a while. And I'd be just as happy if it rotated all the way around the group before coming back to me. And often I can get this informally. Formally, it's a little bit harder and can add in some seemingly artificial constraints, but some may find that those constraints help them reach for greater artistry because they are preparing with the knowledge that other people are going to be operating in this shared world as a game master as they would. It adds some spice that may have been missing. So it's something to consider. Would I do it again? In a heartbeat. You can see examples of this kind of play with us online. For years now, we've been running a game by Triple Ace Games. It's their Supernatural Musketeers game. The Musketeers are not supernatural, but they're living in a world where all of our old beliefs about, what goes bump in the night are actually true. There's magic, there's vampires, there's werewolves, there's all kinds of creatures of hideous disposition and even less appealing outlook. And we have been sharing game mastering responsibility in that world for years. I run an adventure, and the next person runs an adventure, and the next person runs an adventure, and so on until it comes back to me. We have the entire world slowly filling up a file in OneNote, whereas before I would have used a giant 3-ring binder the size of your head. Now everything is just stored digitally. We all have access to it at any time. We have our secret sections, like for the current mission, the current adventure. That's off limits to prying eyes. But all the NPCs are there for everyone to find. The history, the chronology of the events as they've happened. All of our sessions are recorded. All of our commentary about the sessions that we've played are recorded. And so it's this living document that supports ongoing play year after year after year, with all the players also being game masters. This is a pretty informal campaign, yet it manages to go on without stopping in an open-ended, free-form campaign. Other examples in the White Wolf series of games that went Adventure, which was a 1930s pulp game, into Aberrant, which was a 1990s supers game, heavily inspired by the likes of, like Warren Ellis, similar in some regards to Planetary. And then went into a game that was supposed to be called Aeon, but ended up being called Trinity because of frivolous lawsuits. This trilogy of games spanned a vast amount of human history. And I worked in tandem with another game master to split this timeline in half. None of the players were aware that we were collaborating, and they didn't become aware that we were collaborating until more than a year of play, and we were switching between all these periods. Sometimes we'd be playing our characters in the 30s, and sometimes we'd be playing in the early 90s, and sometimes we'd be playing in the late 90s, and sometimes we'd be playing in the far-flung future. And he would be game mastering, or I would be game mastering, and we'd be going back and forth and back and forth. And it was finally revealed that this was all one interconnected universe toward, as we were nearing our second year of play. It's kind of cool. It was a big reveal, and it definitely made it worthwhile. The ability to run a long campaign with a lot of political infighting between PCs and NPCs, between NPCs and NPCs, and between PCs and PCs, enabled by having 4 game masters working interdependently and independently within this tapestry of play, was incredibly satisfying. And be able to do that with up to 13 different players being in the room, some of them with multiple characters, it allowed for incredibly deep play. And with the addition of troop style play as being a part of the mix, as the game master, just being able to give a significant look to one of the people across the room and have them instantly step into the role of this well-established NPC because they usually played them, it gave tremendous consistency and tremendous ability to just simply trust that the consistency was going to positively feed back into the consistency that was previously established. It was going to enforce and reinforce itself every night that we played. And it's just fun. It's fun being able to give your friends the opportunity to play in the settings that they help to create, and play there yourself. Anyway, like I said, this is just the beginning. This is scratching the surface of a deep topic. The game master of many parts, right? The multiple game master paradigm of play. I'd like to hear about whether this was a common part of your play growing up like it was for me. I'd like to hear if this is something that you did formally or informally. If you, like me, found ways to turn it into techniques and procedures of play, or if it's just something that you did without really thinking about it. Are you the kind of player who came from a group where everybody ran games, but all the games were different and none of them were really related? Or did you really share, and collaborate together on this level? I'd really like to hear about it, and the problems that you had, the problems that you solved, and the problems that you can't believe that other people had. So all of this tells us something and helps us transmit these little pockets of play, these pieces of play culture that arose before the internet kind of scattered ideas, sometimes not very sensibly, across the great table of the world. All right, and now for a hopefully brief, what are the odds? A hopefully brief section on and in support of the October OSR event. And I really liked the name OctOSR. I thought that was a really nice way to combine October and OSR, but I seem to be in the minority for that one, which I guess is thematically appropriate. When I think about myself as a role-playing gamer, when I think about myself as a gamer, I see 3 things which separate me from someone who might self-identify as or be identified as, a part of the OSR. So what are those 3 things? Well, 1, I became aware that I wasn't enjoying playing Dungeons and Dragons before second edition really took hold. We didn't play second edition, so I played a lot of different basics and combinations of basics and combination of basic with AD&D. So I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons for a lot of years, and as I became more fluent with the game, and as I steeped myself in where it came from, as I read through Appendix N and all this stuff as a teenager, and I began to recognize that what I liked in the fantasy fiction I was reading on my own and what I liked from the fantasy fiction that was listed in Appendix N, well, it was a struggle to get there with AD&D or Basic. The system didn't match what I wanted to do. So when I became aware enough of that it became a problem for me as a player was around the time that I went to university. And there I met a couple of guys, one of whom loved D&D. And he kind of reignited my passion for the game for a while, and we had a lot of fun campaigns. But another guy in the group was having the same kind of experience as me. The stuff that he wanted to do as a role-playing gamer, those goals weren't being met by D&D, and they wouldn't be met by a switch to the then new second edition Dungeons and Dragons. And so we decided not to go forward with D&D. As a group, we now had access to a bunch of other games, and so we chose to play them. I never looked back. I never went back to Dungeons and Dragons. The guy I talked about who loved D&D from the beginning, well, he stayed a D&D player, and the guy who was on a similar journey to me, he never really had a hard break from Dungeons and Dragons like I did. So our experiences were similar. They were parallel, but not the same. However, between the three of us, I'm the one who continued to play, come hell or high water, whatever the circumstances of my life were. Whereas they either stopped playing altogether or took a long hiatus because of work and kids and all that stuff. So one of the things that separates me from typical old school types who are drawn to the OSR is that I'm not drawn to D&D. And I think we have to accept that Dungeons and Dragons is an essential quality to answering the question of what is the OSR. I'm not attracted to D&D as D&D, and I'm not terribly attracted to fantasy games in general. So this is a thing that separates me from the OSR. Another thing is that I didn't take a break from gaming. A lot of people my age return to gaming. And many of them want to return to the games that they played, but because they took a long break, they didn't have those games anymore. They had been left in a box somewhere. Now nobody knows where they were. They were given to a younger sibling, or etc., etc. They had been separated from the games of their youth, and their efforts to reconnect with the only thing they knew about gaming, the games of their youth, were frustrated by the fact that gaming had moved on. Some of them took a 5-year break, which was still pretty significant, or 10 years, or 20 years, and gaming has changed a lot, since we were all kids. People my age were kids. So the desire to be able to get those rules was a very real one. Now, fortunately, those rules have become available through the license holder. Wizards of the Coast has made D&D available, and lots of other game companies have made earlier editions of their rules available to customers, which is good for archival reasons. It's good for, historical investigation reasons. And it's just fun because sometimes the new edition doesn't do what you want it to. So this is a thing that separates me from many people I find in the OSR. And the last element, right, is that I value the cultures and procedures of play far more than I do the rule sets. But we still haven't reached a point where it's the culture and procedures of play which are being communicated, and where I see the largest amount of fragmentation or argument in the OSR as an outsider to it. When I look at it, when I listen to the arguments, when I listen to the discussions, when I listen to the negotiations and the games that are being played, it's this area about culture of play, procedure of play, goals of play, which are the most contentious. This is the stuff that people agree upon the least. So I don't find many points of connection between me and a fairly old school gamer. I started playing in 1983. So definitely not first wave, just barely in the first decade, but an older gamer who grew up in a time when there weren't that many games to be played, and who grew up with very little access to games until I was 18. And then things started to open up and then open up and open up. But as they opened up, they also started to change. And so as I continued to play throughout this whole period from 83 up to now, next year, if I'm still alive, will be 2023, and that will be an interesting anniversary as a gamer. But I have continued to evolve. I've seen things that I've liked and I have adopted them. I have seen things that I don't enjoy and I've stayed away from them. I've seen things that I enjoy a lot. I've seen things that I can tolerate. My understanding of what role-playing games are, what the tools we can use as role-playing gamers are, these things have expanded and evolved. And I am one of those people who likes to investigate new role-playing games. So I have exposed myself on purpose to games which are very different from the ones that I like and are very similar to the ones that I like. And I've paid attention to how they're written, and I've paid attention to how their rules are formatted, and I've paid attention to how much their creators have paid attention or not paid attention to them. And I've gotten myself involved behind the scenes in editing. So my view of gaming is, I think, inextricably tied to their development over my time in gaming. And I've done my best to go back as far as possible. I've read the histories, I've watched the interviews, I've collected together the old games that I didn't get a chance to, and the ones that were already gone long before I got into the hobby at all. So that's how I'm different from the typical, I think, OSR person. But I have a lot of respect for Dungeons and Dragons. I have a lot of appreciation for my play of it before I grew away from it. And I totally understand the desire, the deep-seated desire to preserve something which is in real danger of disappearing so that it can be appreciated later. I think many people our age have had some opportunity to read like really old science fiction, or to be exposed to really old comics, or in my case being exposed to old pulps and this sort of stuff. And we have found a connection to the viewpoints and the points of enjoyment of earlier generations, which, if the publishers had their way, if license holders had their way, we would not really have access to, we would not have been exposed to. Right? Sometimes the pursuit of a particular pulp novel and that point where you finally get it and can finally read it on its crumbling yellowed paper, it is a magical and transformative experience. Being a part of preserving cultures of play, which by their nature, by their ephemeral nature, this was conversation held in small groups, right? Our games, our adventures, our characters, the places where they journeyed, none of these things exist in lasting records. Those adventures are not carved in stone. Many of them are not even written on loose leaf in a ring binder. They're transitory. They only have the durability of memory. And we're all getting older, and our memories are fading. So being a part of a concerted and organized effort to preserve the vehicles of play so that those experiences of play can be rediscovered and experienced anew by younger gamers, I think is incredibly valid. This is one of the beacons of value in the OSR. But that there are arguments about what the OSR even is confuses me, and perhaps this is my perspective as an outsider. It reminds me of arguments of genre when genre is connected to identity. What is and isn't goth? What is and isn't heavy metal? What is and isn't industrial music? Who is and who is not a punk? And it strikes me that OSR is not a genre of play, and OSR is not a game, and OSR is not a people or even really a movement. OSR is a brand. It's a descriptor. And it's one of those labels which can divide as much as it brings people together. And there's evidence of this all over. And so that makes me hesitant. That makes me want to stay an outsider, even though now the OSR is growing to embrace games that I am interested in. Let's look at other old school games and how they enshrine, how they create, how they support that old culture of play, that newcomer culture of play, and let's share those with coming generations. The OSR has moved beyond Dungeons and Dragons into other old games because it's about how we played as old school gamers that leads to the desire to share the documentation, to share the rules, to share our thoughts on those rules, to share our thoughts on how we played. Old schoolers, well, we're still alive. Some of us aren't even that old or don't feel that old. Some of us are nearing the end of our days, and what they have to share should be listened to and should be remembered. But when products are involved, money is involved, branding is involved, and the desire to protect a territory rears up. Sometimes this comes from the fans, sometimes this comes from the producers, sometimes it comes from both. You're not punk enough, you're not metal enough. We can be territorial. And the OSR does not lay claim to any special virulence or virility in its territoriality. Pretty much any group, sports fans, restaurant fans, music fans, are all guilty or can be guilty of it. So, if we, as gamers, learn how to advance the frankly stagnant conversation about role-playing games that we have cycled and recycled again since the very first years of play, if we can learn how to learn, if we can learn how to read rules and have the conversation be about how we're going to use them, if we can recognize that tools are tools and tools have effects and system matters, and if we concern ourselves with how system will matter with the group we're playing this game with this time, right now, then the work of the OSR will be of tremendous importance in preserving these old games in usable formats that, as our eyes grow weaker, can still be read to us by the machine. As our capacity to move things from place to place diminishes, as we get bundled off into retirement homes where we have to shack up with some stranger from somewhere else with very few belongings, having this digital record of a bygone print age will be of tremendous importance. And if, as I say, we can learn to have the right conversations about role-playing games, then seeing these sparse rules with their idiosyncratic art will trigger in us the ability to figure out why they are the way they are and how we can best use them for our enjoyment. And so a role-playing game from 40 years ago can be just as fresh and exciting and interesting and give us things to think about and talk about and discuss, grow into, or step away from as any game written yesterday. I have a lot of respect for people who have gone from being gamers, who have taught themselves publishing, who have taught themselves product management, who have established for themselves a way to connect with the wider world of gamers through their passion for a particular expression of a particular set of rules. I have even more respect for those for whom that's just the beginning. They express themselves in a familiar set of rules, perhaps because of the open game license, and then go on to create their own and share those as well. These OSR publishers who have grown into being, well, not OSR publishers, just publishers. The temptation to retain the brand of OSR for recognition, for the community, for reach out, it's understandable. And it's understandable how it can cause division in our groupthink, in our territorial natures. But we have it within us to question, we have it within us to change, we have it within us to learn. And so, as always, there's hope. And so, although I am not self-identifying as OSR, and though the games I play don't tie me to it, well, I am, in many regards, old school. That old school primer speaks about how I play my games just as much as it speaks about how someone rediscovers BX. We can't lay claim to the procedures of play or the cultures of play. They come from us. And they're not necessarily old school either. And this is the last element that I want to talk about. Sometimes we end up using terms even though we don't know what they mean. And OSR is a great example of this. And it becomes reinforced through use and misuse. Words like story, words like prepare, words like improvise. Sometimes they can end up meaning things that we did not intend. What we said wasn't interpreted for what we meant by the listener. And of course, we have no way to know that. We do talk with other gamers, but often we talk to other gamers, or we talk near other gamers. And the words of the past have no way to explain themselves unless we are around to share and give context in a non-judgmental, non-preferential way. And this is a two-way street. The person who is asking the question needs to be open to the answer. The person answering the question needs to be able to answer without fear of judgment and without prejudgment themselves. And if anybody can do this, if anybody can put themselves in the shoes of another person, shouldn't it be us? You've been listening to an episode of the Casting Shadows podcast. If you've made it this far, thank you for your patience, and hopefully thank you for your attention. And with greater hope still, I hope to interact with you on these topics or the others raised by the podcast, the blog, or the YouTube channel, in all the places in which I can be contacted. You can find a link in the show description. Anyway, until the next time, take care.